This video is on percents, the main topic, and we're going to be talking about percent and number equivalents, and we're going to do this in two parts. This is part one, and in part one our objective is to write any number as a percent equivalent. So we want to take a number and write it as its equivalent percent in its percent form. Okay, let's first define the word percent. Percent, if you break it apart, per is the prefix, and cent, of course, means 100, as in century or cents in a dollar. So percent means per 100. Another way to talk about that is per means out of. So percent is out of 100. Or you could think about this as parts per 100. Obviously, all of these have the 100 in common. We're going to be talking about percentage, what takes place out of 100. Okay, what do we know? All right, let me get this up here for you. What do we know? We know a couple of things. First off, what we know, number one here, is we know that when we have two ratios or two fractions that are equal to one another, they form what's called a proportion. And when we have a proportion, we know the cross products of a proportion are equal. So let's take a look at that and remind ourselves about that in an example. So when I tell you that 4/5 is equal to 16/20, I have two ratios or two fractions that are equal. And so these two fractions being equal, they form a proportion. Okay, proportion is when you have two ratios or two fractions that are equal. So if I move further, if they form a proportion, I know the cross products are equal. So if I cross the numerator 16 of this fraction times the denominator of 5 of this fraction, 16 times 5 over here, I know that is equal to the numerator of the left fraction in this case times the denominator of the right fraction, 4 times 20. So I go across the equal signs, and I make a nice X here, which indicates, you can also think to indicate multiplication. So 16 times 5 is equal to 4 times 20. If we do the math, 16 times 5 is 80, 4 times 20 is 80, and they're obviously equal. So these two form a proportion. If we do their cross products are equal. 80 is equal to 80. That's the first thing we know. The second thing we know that we're going to use is that when we multiply a number by 100, okay, what happens is the result of that is that it moves the decimal two places to the right. So multiplying something by 100 results in the decimal moving two places to the right. Here's an example. 2.37 or 2 37/100 times 100. If you put it in your calculator, you'll get 237. Okay. If you just look at it and move the decimal's here. We move it two places to the right, so behind the 3 to behind the 7, so here it is, and you get 237. So multiplying a number by 100 results in moving the decimal two places to the right. It's kind of a quick shortcut as opposed to pulling out your calculator. Okay, so to write any number as a percent equivalent, we do two things. As necessary, we're going to rewrite the number as a fraction. Okay, if it's already a proper fraction, this is done. If it's an improper fraction, this is done. If it's a whole number, we're going to write it as a fraction, an improper fraction. If it's a mixed number, we're going to write it as a fraction. If it's a decimal, we're going to write it as a fraction. So we want to write whatever number we have as a fraction. And then number two, you have two ways you can do this. You either use the percent proportion, which we'll take a look at, or you divide and multiply the result. You divide numerator divided by denominator, and then you multiply the result by 100. And we'll do the example in that way as well. So this is what we're going to use to come up with how to change a number into its equivalent percent. All right. We're going to do about, I think I've got 5 or 6. I think I've got 6 examples to see some variation in what this is all about. The first one, let's change 5/8 to its percent equivalent. Okay, the percent proportion okay, we'll look at that first method, tells us that 5/8 equals the percent out of 100. This is the percent proportion. The fraction is equal to whatever it's, something out of 100, because percent is always out of 100. And we know that if two fractions are equivalent or two ratios are equivalent, they form a proportion and the cross products are equivalent. So we'll cross multiply 8 times x. We'll cross multiply 5 times 100. I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this, and I'm going to do the math on the right. 5 times 100 is 500. And then we can solve for x by dividing both sides by 8. And of course, this is the 1. So we have an x, and I'll need a calculator for this next part. So I'll come over to here and pull in my calculator. I think I got it in there. Okay, and I want to do 500 divided by 8. Put in 8. And the answer is 62.5%. 62.5%. So this tells me 62.5%. That's how to change it using the percent proportion. Now the other method, where we divide and then multiply by 100. Okay, so there's the other choice. You can divide and then multiply by 100. Okay, here's 5/8. It's already a fraction. I can divide. So this is 5 divided by 8. I'll write that down just so you remember. Numerator divided by denominator. Okay, 5 divided by 8. I need a calculator. So 5 divided by 8 is 0.625. So there's my divide. There's my divide first. It's a fraction, 5 divided by 8. And then I multiply that by 100. And I come up with 62.5%. So 5/8 is equivalent to 62.5%. Okay, so those are the two, by far the two most popular methods. There may be some other ones, but one of them, I forgot over here to make my other cross arrow. So one possibility is to set it up as a percent proportion. Because you've already included the number 100, there's no need to do any further math once you're done down here. The second method says you can just simply divide, numerator divided by denominator, and then multiply the result by 100, because you need to get 100 in there to get a percent, 62.5. Okay, let's take a look at a second example. How about what is 0.7, excuse me, as a percent? Okay, what is 0.7 as a percent? Well, first things first, we need to write this as a fraction, and this 7 is in the tenths place. So as a fraction, 0.7 is equal to 7/10. Now we can move on. We can do the percent proportion. Okay, 7/10 is equal to what out of 100? Because we want to find the percent, and that's the numerator here. Now you can see here, of course we can cross multiply and divide, and I will do that in just a moment. But you can see here, maybe this one might be a little bit quicker. You can say, wait a second, 10 times 10 is 100. So if I do the same thing with the numerator, I'll get the answer. 7 times 10 is 70. So the answer is 70%. If you see that. Now if you look here at this first example, most people aren't very sure what 8 times what is 100. You know, most people aren't sure what the factor is to get from 8 to 100. So cross multiplying and dividing is probably the best way. But most people, when they get down to here and look at something like this, well, you know, 10 times 10 is 100. So 7 times 10. That's a quick way to do it. But we know that it's a proportion, so we can cross multiply. And I get 7 times 100. I'll just put 700 in this side. And then I can divide both sides by 10 to get x by itself. 10 divided by 10, of course, is 1, and 1 times x is x. 700 divided by 10 is, of course, 70. So the answer is 70%. That's the percent proportion method. Okay, how about the divide and then times 100 method? Okay, 7/10. Well, let's divide it. 7 divided by 10. Okay. Let's see here. Get my calculator back in there. 7 divided by 10. Well, that's just 0.7. We're just back where we started from. 0.7. And then times 100. And 0.7 times 100, the decimal moves 2 places, 1, 2, and you come up with 70%. Okay? So, now, which one you use depends upon, you know, what you see and what you want to work with. You know, I tend to see pretty quickly. I tend to just work with 5 divided by and then times 100, but certainly when I see 7/10, then I know that I can automatically just do that by 10. 7/10 times 100. The decimal just moves twice, so this times 100 will work out pretty well. But in this proportion, I would say, oh, this is times 10 times 10. So it just kind of depends on how you want to work and what you want to do. But the general idea, until you get comfortable with it, is these two methods will keep you straight until you get comfortable with various shortcuts and maybe various other ways of thinking about it. Okay, let's take a look at a third example. As I told you, I think we're going to do 6. I think I'll use another piece of paper, but we'll get there. So example 3, let's take, how about 3/1000ths? What is 3, whoops, yeah, let's hang on a second here. What is 3 over 1,000? What is 3/1000ths as a percent? Okay, well, it's already a fraction, so we don't have to do any changes. Let's take a look at the percent proportion method. Okay, it's already a fraction, so we can write it. 3/1000 is equal to what out of 100, because percent is always out of 100. Okay, well again, if you see here that this number divided by 10 gives you this number, you can take 3 divided by 10 and get the percent. If you don't see that, you always know that you can cross multiply, because the cross products and proportions are always equivalent. 3 times 100 is 300. And then to solve for x, it's times 1,000, so we'll divide by 1,000. And that's a 1, and 1 times x is just x. And 300 divided by 1,000 is 0.3%. Okay. Remember, our answer is going to be a percent because we use the percent proportion. 300 divided by 1,000 is 0.3. So this number is a little less than 1%. So it's actually closer to 0% than 1%, but it's in between 0 and 1%. We can again use the divide and multiply by 100 method. And this method says, okay, 3/1000ths, that's my fraction. I'm going to divide it. So 3 divided by 1,000. I know the answer to that. and that is this right here. It's 3 thousandths. And I'm going to multiply that by 100, and I know that means I move the decimal 2 places, or I can use my calculator, and I come up with 0.3 like I did back here. Move it 2 places, 1, 2, and the decimal is right in front of the 3, and there it is right there. So that's that method. Okay, excuse me while I get a piece of paper here. Okay, let's do 3 more examples. Let's see here. Okay, let me get my paper straightened out. I think I'm pretty good. I think that works. Okay, example 4. Let's change. I'm going to do 2 more examples actually, because I think this other one is pretty similar. 1 6/10 to its percent equivalent. Okay, this is a mixed number. It's a whole number plus a fraction, and we need to write it as a fraction. Every mixed number will be written as an improper fraction. Improper fractions and mixed numbers. Improper fractions become mixed numbers become improper fractions. So first things first, let's as a fraction. Okay. The way I was taught how to do mixed numbers is start with the denominator times whole number plus numerator. So 10 times 1 is 10, plus 6 is 16. That's your new numerator. And then you use the same denominator. So as a fraction, 1 6/10 is the same as 16/10. Another way to think about it is that 1 is 10/10. Well, 10/10 plus 6/10 is 16/10. That's 2 ways to think about it. Okay, let's do the percent proportion. Now, before we get started on this number is greater than 1. It's 1 and something, so the percent should be greater than 100 because 1 is 100%. Well, let's see here. Our fraction is 16/10. I want to change that to something out of 100. Okay. As we saw before, we could do 10 times 10. We can see that 10 times 10 is 100, so 16 times 10 will give us the answer. If we don't see that, we can do our cross products, because when you have a proportion, the cross products are equal. Okay, let's solve for x. This is the 1. 1 times x is just x. And 1,600 divided by 10 is 160. So indeed, our percent is greater than 100%. So every time you see an improper fraction or you see a mixed number, you should know that your percent is going to be greater than 100. Proper fractions, the percent is less than 100. Improper fractions, the percent is greater than 100. If you want to do the divide and then multiply method, divide and then times 100 method. Okay, so we know it's 16/10. We're going to divide it. So it's 16 divided by 10. 16 divided by 10 with a calculator is 1.6 if you need it. 1.6 times 100, well, that moves the decimal 2 places to the right, 1, 2. And that gives me the 160, the decimal, of course, winding up right at after the 0. 1, and then one more move to get to 160%. Okay, last example, let's do a whole number. Okay, so this example is, let's say, what is 11 as a percent? Okay, now 11 is greater than 1. So this should be greater than 100%. Okay, now as a fraction, if you want to see it, again, tells us write this as a fraction. Every whole number can be written as a fraction by writing it over the number 1. So as a fraction, 11 is just 11 over 1. That's a fraction. Okay, so we can go back to our two methods now. Okay, we can use our percent proportion because we have a fraction. So we have 11 over 1, and we want to know what is that out of 100. Okay, well again, we can look quickly and see that 1 times 100 is 100, so 11 times 100 will give us the percent. Or we can cross multiply. In this case, x times 1 is x. 11 times 100 is 1100, and that's the percent. Okay, so 11 as a percent is 1,100%. Significant. The second method is we can do divide and then multiply by 100. Okay, so 11 divided by 1 is 11. And I'll say, well, I'll rewrite this first. 11 divided by 1 is 11, and then times 100. 11 times 100, well, it's 1100. If you, the decimal's here, move it 2 places. In both cases, you get 1,100%. So you've seen, you know, I really focused on these two methods, but you can see there are also some shortcuts you can take here and there as you begin to get comfortable with what you're doing.